The subject of my lecture this morning is the Council of Florence, a success that failed, question mark. And the second half of my title, a success that failed, I borrow from the eminent historian of the Council of Florence, Father Joseph Gill of the Society of Jesus. And his account of the Florentine Council, written 50 years ago, is still much the most authoritative work on the subject in the English language. It offers a marvelous narrative of the council. In the case of the Council of Florence, we have a great deal of information. We know more or less what happened from day to day in the debates. It is very different, for example, with certain other councils, such as the Council of Nicaea in 325, where our information is very scanty. Now, the Council of Ferrara, Florence, 1438 to 39, was the last occasion on which Orthodox and Roman Catholics met at the highest official level. The council regarded itself as ecumenical. In the decree of union, which was ratified on the 6th of July 1439, Litenta Caeli, they refer to themselves as in hac sacro sancta synodo ecumenica, in this holy ecumenical synod. And so for the Roman Catholic tradition, this is reckoned to be the 17th ecumenical council, though I think at the time they thought of themselves rather as the 8th ecumenical council and did not take account of the general synods held in the West. The Orthodox, as you will know, do not accept Florence as an ecumenical council. We would refer to it as a pseudo-synod. Let us note that for Roman Catholics, the Council of Florence actually continued till 1445. After the union with the Greeks in 1439, later in the same year, a union was reached with the Armenians. Then in 1442, a union was reached with the Copts and Ethiopians. In 1444 with the Syrians of Mesopotamia, and in 1445 with the Maronites and Chaldeans of Cyprus. I shall be looking, however, simply at the negotiations with the Greeks. Why should we call it a success that failed? From one point of view, it was a success, in the sense that the Act of Union in 1439 was signed by the Pope and the Latin bishops. It was signed by the Byzantine Emperor and the Greek bishops, with the exception, very notable exception, of the Archbishop of Ephesus, Mark Evgenikos, who refused to sign. The patriarchal see was vacant at this moment because Patriarch Joseph of Constantinople had died during the course of the council, but he seems also to have endorsed the union before his death. Yet the council failed so far as the Christian East went. It was overwhelmingly rejected by the Greeks and the Slavs. Was this failure inevitable? Stephen Runciman, in his well-known work, The Eastern Schism, written in published in 1955, I remember it being delivered as lectures in Oxford the year before. I attended some of them as an undergraduate. Stephen Runciman says in that work, "I do not think it possible that terms can now be found on which the breach can be healed." Is he right? Today, let's start with some advice given by a Greek from South Italy, Barlaam, the Calabrian, in a speech delivered at Avignon in 1339 to Pope Benedict XII. Barlaam, who was an opponent of St. Gregory Palavas, but he was no fool, has this to say: there is only one way for union, a general council to be held in the East. For the Greeks admit that all that has been determined in a general council conforms to the faith. You will object, saying that already at Lyon a council to treat of union was held. But no one of the Greeks will accept that the Council of Lyon was ecumenical, unless another council declares it so. The Greeks present at Lyon had been delegated neither by the four patriarchs who govern the Eastern Church, nor by the people, but by the emperor alone, who, without seeking to gain their consent, wanted to achieve union by force. Therefore, send legates to the four patriarchs. Under their presidency, a general council will be held, which will make union. And all those who have been present at this council will say to the people, "Here is what the Holy General Council has decreed. It is your duty to observe its decisions." And all will submit. Now, Barlaam's reference to the Second Council of Lyon, held in 1274, is surely justified. The three Greek representatives at that council were delegates of the Emperor Michael VIII. They were not delegates of the Byzantine Church, which, strictly speaking, was never a participant in that council. The Emperor Michael was required to sign a profession of faith before his delegates went to the council. And the delegates at the council simply confirmed this profession of faith. There was no discussion of doctrine at Lyon. So when Barlaam says that the Greeks were not convinced that Lyon was a true council of union, he surely has a good reason for saying that. The Oxford Dictionary of Byzantium says that the Second Council of Lyon was little more than the consummation of a political deal. Now, Florence was very different. Does it, however, conform to Barlaam's conditions? First, it was, in outward form, a general council. In contrast to Lyon, there was a full Greek representation. The Emperor John VIII came in person to the Council of Florence. Indeed, he considered that it was he and not the Pope who had summoned the council. The Patriarch of Constantinople, Joseph II, came in person and died at Florence on the 10th of June. There were 18 Greek metropolitans. That was the figure at the time of their arrival in Ferrara. Some of these metropolitans were acting as procurators for the other three Eastern patriarchates. So in principle, all four patriarchates of the East were represented. They were accompanied by lay officials, monks, courtiers, and servants. The Greek party amounted altogether to about 700 persons. On the Latin side, the Pope was present in person, Eugenius IV. There was the cardinals were there, the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem was there, and the Patriarch of Grado. There were altogether about 160 representatives on the Latin side, archbishops, bishops, abbots, and theological experts. So outwardly, it did conform to the pattern of being a general council. It was representative of the two sides. Secondly, unlike Lyon, there was at Florence full theological discussion. Indeed, the council went on for 16 months, though the public plenary sessions were not continuous. A lot of work was done in smaller committees. The Pope had undertaken to pay the expenses of the Greeks while they were in Italy, and he had expected the council to last partly for 2 or 3 weeks. And he was a bit dismayed having to pay for 16 months for these 700 people. And indeed, he ran out of money, had to go cap in hand to the moneylenders in Florence. There was free discussion. Again and again, John VIII, who was in favor of union, allowed Mark of Ephesus, Saint Mark for us Orthodox, to be the main speaker on the Greek side, although the emperor knew perfectly well that Mark was going to speak against the union. The emperor desired union for political reasons. Constantinople was in a desperate state. If you go up the Bosphorus, you will see on the right a fortress, the Anatoli Hisar, which was built half a day's journey from Constantinople, the end of the 14th century, by the Turks. So there were the Turks at the very doors of Constantinople. On the opposite side, the European side of the Bosphorus, there's another castle, the Rumeli Hisar, which was not built to 1452. But by the time of the Council of Florence, the Byzantine Empire was reduced to tiny dimensions. It seemed it was only going to be a matter of time before the city was taken. And the one hope was effective aid from the West. So that was what John hoped, the emperor, from the council. But he perhaps desired union sincerely for religious reasons. But however strong his desire for unity, he did not coerce the Greeks. And he gave full freedom to Mark and other Greeks to express views. After the council, the Greeks claimed that they were put under pressure. They claimed that the money the Pope had promised them for their maintenance was not paid on time. That's true, because the Pope hadn't got the money. But neither Pope Eugenius nor the Emperor John deliberately placed the Greeks in difficulties in order to extort their submission. There was a free and full interchange of views, leading to almost complete agreement. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Council of Florence is that it ever took place in the way it did. But Barlaam's third condition was not met. Barlaam said you must have a general council in the east, and in fact the council met in Italy. And it's not surprising, bearing in mind the exposed position of Constantinople with the Turks at the gates, it really wasn't practical to meet there. But quite apart from the military situation, would any pope in the later Middle Ages, in fact, have agreed for a general council to be held in the East? I think not. Yet, did not the place where the council met have a major effect on the proceedings? The Greeks were cut off from home, cut off from their roots, from their people, isolated. They were full of anxiety about the situation in Constantinople. During the course of the council, rumors were rife that the city had already fallen. And during 1.5 years of absence, they grew increasingly demoralized. I'm sure all of you will recall committee meetings, which go on and on, 3-4 hours in the afternoon. And by the end of the afternoon, one has a feeling of desperation. We must make some decision. We can't just go on and on like this. And under those circumstances, people often make unwise decisions that they regret afterwards. But in the case of the Greeks, they had been cut off from their roots for 1.5 years. And they wondered, would the council ever end? Would they go on and on arguing? And they must have been desperate to get home. Many of them must have felt, well, let's sign and be done with it and go back. Here is a description by the Greek chronicler Ducas, and he's describing how, as the Greeks returned home, they began to become very worried about what they had done at Florence. And they asked themselves, how shall we present this union to our people? And this is the difficulty of these kind of union meetings, that they take place in isolation, and then they've got to be accepted. And that's where the problem over Florence arises, the reception of the council. Now here is Ducas' account, which I might say is something of a travesty. He's writing 20 years later. As the metropolitans disembarked from the ships, the citizens, as was customary, saluted them, asking, how about our business? How about the synod? Did we manage to prevail? They answered, we have sold our faith. We have exchanged true piety for impiety. We have betrayed the pure sacrifice and become upholders of unleavened bread. These and even more disgraceful things they said. And who were they that said them? The very ones that had signed the decree, Antony of Heraclea and all of them. If anyone asked them, why then did you sign? They said, for fear of the Franks. And if any demanded further, whether the Franks had tortured anyone, scourged anyone, imprisoned anyone, no, they said. Well then, "This hand has signed," they repeated. "Off with it. My tongue professed, let it be torn out." They had nothing else to say, yet some of the metropolitans said in the act of signing, "We do not sign unless you provide us with a goodly sum of money." They gave it. The pen was dipped into the ink. The money expended on them, counted into the hand of each, was beyond calculation. Later, when they repented, they did not return the money. On their own confession, then, that they had sold their faith, they sinned far more than Judas, for he at any rate restored the pieces of silver. Now, a lot of that is untrue. And I think particularly there is no evidence whatever that the Greeks were bribed. As I say, the Pope had run out of money anyway, long before the council ended. But that was the legend that went down. And I think this was the problem, that the Greek people were not involved in the negotiations, and they never accepted the union. There was a huge psychological gap. And when the bishops returned back to Constantinople, most of them recanted quite quickly. Not the Emperor John. He upheld the union while he lived, but he wouldn't enforce it with violence. Michael VIII had used violence, but John VIII did not. It's very remarkable the way John VIII treated St. Mark of Ephesus, the great supporter of orthodoxy at the council. As the council drew to an end, Pope Eugenius said, "I think it would be a good idea if you leave Mark behind here in Italy." And I don't suppose anything terrible would have happened to Mark. He would merely have been shut up in a monastery and denied the use of paper or ink. And there he would have remained for the rest of his life. But Mark got wind of this, and he went to the emperor and said, "Take me back to Constantinople. Afterwards do what you like with me, but take me home. Don't leave me here in Italy." And the emperor promised and took him back on his own boat. And Mark was indeed put under arrest for some time, but he was able to communicate easily with people, to write against the council, to spread propaganda against it. And there we see how John did not enforce the council by violence. So I do not think the Latins exercised illicit pressure on the Greeks, but the very situation of the council put the Greeks in a weak position. No mobile phones to keep in touch with your friends. That's an interesting question. Why did the Greeks go to Ferrara and not to Basel? There was a rival council up in Basel, the conciliarists, who held that a general council is higher than the Pope. You might have thought that the Greeks would have preferred to go there. And they were invited by the Council of Basel at the same time as Pope Eugenius invited them to come to a council. I think there are three reasons why they chose to accept the Pope's invitation and not that of the conciliarists. First, Basel is more distant than Ferrara or Florence. You've got to cross the Alps. Secondly, the Greeks thought that the Pope would have greater political influence. And remember that this is a decisive factor for the Greeks, especially for the emperor. He wants help from the Western princes, and he feels that it is the Pope who is more likely than the conciliarists at Basel to be able to bring pressure on the Western princes to send troops. But I think more profoundly there was a theological reason. The Greeks could not envisage any reunion with the West that was not negotiated through the Pope. No, they didn't ascribe to him direct power of jurisdiction in the East, but they did regard him as holding the first place in the Christian world, as the most senior among the patriarchs. And so they, I think, would have wished to negotiate union with the Pope, not with some group opposed to him. Let me briefly summarize the outward events of the council and then look at some theological points. So, the 4th of March 1438, the Greeks arrived in Florence, no, in Ferrara, in great splendor. Some of you perhaps in Florence have been to the Palazzo Medici Riccardi, where in the chapel there is a famous fresco by Benozzo Gozzoli showing the journey of the Magi. And the Magi are shown as the Greeks, the Emperor John VIII, the Patriarch, and others. In this depiction of the journey of the Magi, there are portraits of them. And certainly the entry of the Greeks into Ferrara was picturesque and influential. Matters got off to a difficult start because the Pope specified that the Patriarch of Constantinople must kiss his foot, as all bishops were required to do at that time. And the Byzantine Emperor John VIII said, "No way, that is absolutely excluded. I will not allow my patriarch to be treated in this manner." So there was no solemn opening, no greeting by the Pope. All that happened was the Pope came into the church through one door, the Patriarch came in through another door, and they took their seats. But the Byzantines stood firm, no foot kissing. Interestingly, I think in 1982, the representative of the Ecumenical Patriarch, Metropolitan Melita of Chalcedon, came to Rome and was received by Pope Paul VI in the Sistine Chapel. And to everybody's astonishment, Pope Paul knelt down and kissed the Metropolitan's feet. And I read that as an act of reparation for the demand that had been made in Florence. Though I don't think Pope Paul VI ever explained exactly why he did this. I looked at the photographs taken at the time, and you see all these monsignori in lace cotta standing round the Pope, and they think, their absolute astonishment on their faces, they think the Pope has suddenly been taken ill, but it was deliberate. They took a long time to get going with the doctrinal discussions because very few of the Western princes had yet turned up. And the emperor said, we must not begin the main discussions till they are here. So, on the other hand, the Pope didn't want to feed these 700 people with nothing happening at all. So they said, let us start by discussing not the main issue, which was the filioque and the procession of the Holy Spirit. Let's discuss purgatory, the state of the departed, the blessedness of the saints. This had begun to be a controversial issue in probably the 14th century. But in fact, it had not figured prominently in debates between the Orthodox and the Catholics at an earlier period. And this shows the danger of saying too much. Until Florence, I think a lot of points concerning the departed had not been so very clearly fixed in Latin theology. And the result of having a long discussion at the council was that the Latin position hardened. Talking with other people does not necessarily bring you closer to them. You can, in fact, sometimes find more reasons for disagreeing. There's a danger of saying too much. It wasn't until the 8th of October that they got onto the real doctrinal discussions, the Filioque. Then in January 1439 they moved to Florence. Fear of the plague in Ferrara. Also the enemies of the Pope, supported by Milan, were very close to Ferrara, and perhaps the Pope thought it would be easier to raise money in Florence. And they continued the discussions until the 6th of July 1439, when the Act of Union was signed. It's very interesting to see how much time they spent on different questions. On the procession of the Holy Spirit and the addition of the Filioque to the Creed, they spent 10 months on and off. The discussions were not continuous. On purgatory and the blessedness of the saints, they spent about 4 months. On papal primacy, they spent only 10 days, right at the end, when everybody wanted to go home. We have a very different order of priorities today, where the question of the papal primacy would be seen as the key issue. But that was not the view in the 15th century. 15th century, the key issue was seen as the question of the Holy Spirit. On the Greek side, very few of the bishops took an active part. Only 3 of them acted as speakers. Chiefly Mark of Ephesus, but also Bessarion of Nicaea and Isidore of Kiev, who was Greek but representing the Russian Church. All 3 of them had been appointed by the emperor just before the council. The Greeks by the 15th century were short on scholarship. There's no doubt that intellectually the Latin team was far stronger. Most of the Greek bishops would be monks who had not had anything resembling a university training, who had partly read something of the Fathers, but were not trained in debate in the way that the Latins would have been in the university system prevailing in the West. Most of the Greeks then took no part at all in the discussions. Let me illustrate something of the difficulties of communication. The 21st of March 1439, Giovanni of Montenero, of the Dominicans, speaking from the Latin side, delivered a speech lasting all day on the procession of the Holy Spirit. And when it got dark, he hadn't yet finished. So the next meeting, the 24th of March, he continued nearly all day. When he finished, he asked if there were any questions. There was, not surprisingly, silence. Finally, Isidore, on the Greek side, said, you've been talking to us for over 8 hours. Could we perhaps have your arguments in writing? Now, one thinks that to have discussions like this is not perhaps the best way to clarify matters. I think the greater majority of the Greek bishops understood very little of the proceedings, and they must have been bored out of their minds, sitting there week after week and month after month, listening to all the discussions. Now, a serious effort was made at Florence to distinguish between the primary and the secondary issues. They really tried to limit themselves to points of genuine substance. To us today, that might seem fairly obvious, but if you look in the Middle Ages at most of the discussions between Greeks and Latins, you will see that they were carried out at a very different level. Some of you may know this fascinating book by Tia Kolbaba, called The Byzantine Lists, Errors of the Latins. And she discusses a number of the lists of errors during the medieval period that the Greeks were putting out. And here are the kind of criticisms that they make of the Latins. The Latins use salt and saliva in baptism. They fast on Saturdays. They eat unclean foods. I quote, strangled beasts, frogs, bears, jackals, and tortoises. The monks eat lard and meat. They allow marriage within the forbidden degrees. Now, this is a more serious one. The bishops and priests take part in battle. That was very shocking to the Byzantines, that a priest should kill people. The bishops wear rings. The priests shave. Icons are not properly revered. Well, that's more serious too, because it's a question how far the Seventh Ecumenical Council was ever really received in the West. The Latins make the sign of the cross incorrectly. They trace the cross on the ground and then stamp on it. I don't know where that originates from. And here's the pot calling the kettle black. The Latins talk too much in church. Well, who are we to say that? But this is what happens when you've reached a state of hostility. You will think up as many criticisms as possible, and you will lump everything together, trivial and serious, just to throw at the other side. Back in the 11th century, writing on the Greek side, Theophylact of Ochride says the real problem is, between us and the Latins, love has grown cold. Once that happens, then anything is good enough to throw at the other side. Well, Florence avoided these trivial issues and tried to stick to the real point. And I think there's very little evidence of the one side insulting the other. That's greatly to their credit. But more importantly, Ferrara Florence laid down a fundamental and far-reaching principle. They were quite clear what they wanted was unity in faith, but they allowed diversity in liturgical practice and in ecclesiastical customs. And that approach was, I think, at the time, revolutionary, to make that kind of distinction. There are plenty of instances on other occasions where one side tries to make the other conform to their liturgical uses. But at Florence, the Latins did not demand the imposition of their own right. So, as regards the Holy Spirit, the Greeks were required to accept the doctrine of the double procession, but they were not required to add the filioque to the creed. As regards unleavened bread, which had been highly controversial in the 11th century, at Florence it was agreed that each side should follow its own liturgical custom. This was not a matter of doctrine, and it was perfectly possible to have a plurality of uses here. Other things that don't seem to have been raised at Florence: clerical celibacy. From time to time, the Orthodox object to the way Latin clergy are required to be celibate. That doesn't seem to have been raised at Florence. It was assumed that each church would follow its own custom. I was looking in Gill's book on the Council of Florence, and I couldn't find any reference to clerical celibacy at all. It just doesn't seem to have been discussed. There were occasional references to the epiclesis, which had become controversial in the 14th century, I think, when some Greeks began saying that the Latin Mass was defective because there was no epiclesis of the Holy Spirit, though someone like St. Nicholas Cavasilas was wiser than to make that a charge against the Latins. But I think at Florence, again, that wasn't raised. It was just assumed each side would follow their own customs. So I think this is a great achievement by Florence, not only that they kept all these trivial things about eating tortoises out of the discussion, but that they made this distinction between faith and liturgical practice and allowed diversity. Over the Holy Spirit, the Latin argument is interesting. They did not argue that the Greeks were wrong. They said that fundamentally there was no difference between the Greek and the Latin position. In other words, that the whole dispute was due to a misunderstanding. So they were content to say to the Greeks, you may continue to say that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father through the Son, but we will continue to say he proceeds from the Father and from the Son. And in this case, saying from the Son and saying through the Son is the same thing. So it wasn't said that the Greeks were wrong and had to change. The Latin argument was that we've never really disagreed. It's all a mistake. The Greek and Latin fathers, this was the Latin position, are affirming the same truths but in different ways. And it's notable that the Council of Florence upheld the monarchy of the Father. It's very clearly said in the Act of Union that the Father is the source and principle of the Godhead, and therefore that the Son, the Spirit does not proceed from the Son in the same way as he proceeds from the Father. And that is the position of St. Augustine, that the Holy Spirit proceeds de patre principaliter, principally from the Father, and he proceeds from the Son only per donum patris, through the gift of the Father. So Augustine is likewise quite clear that the Father is the source of hypostatic origin, and that was the position of Florence. That, however, didn't satisfy St. Mark of Ephesus. And just to give you an idea of his position, here is his appeal to the Latins to leave out the filioque. This symbol, this noble heritage of our fathers, we demand back from you. Restore it then as you received it. It may not be enlarged, it may not be diminished. It has been closed and sealed, and such as dare to innovate in its regard are cast out, and those who fashion another in its stead are laid under penalty. The addition of a word seems to you a small matter and of no great consequence. So then, to remove it would cost you little or nothing. Indeed, it would be of great profit, for it would bind together all Christians. But what was done was, in truth, a big matter and of the greatest consequence. It was added in the exercise of mercy. In the exercise of mercy, remove it again, so that you may receive to your bosoms brethren torn apart, who value fraternal love so highly. That's Mark's position, so he is not willing to accept the Latin argument. The council's fairly moderate over purgatory. The Orthodox didn't like the phrase that after death souls are purged by purgatorial penalties, poenis purgatorius purgari, because they would say expiation is only through the cross of Christ. But Florence didn't actually use the word purgatory as a place, and it made no reference to fire. The papacy, here the statement seems rather emphatic, but is it really so? This is what the Decree of Florence says. We also define that the Holy Apostolic See and the Roman Pontiff holds the primacy, primatus, over the whole world. And the Roman Pontiff is the successor of Blessed Peter of the Apostles, Prince of the Apostles, and that he is the true Vicar of Christ, the head of the whole Church, and the father and teacher of all Christians. And to him was committed in Blessed Peter the full power of tending, ruling, and governing the whole Church, as is contained also in the Acts of the Ecumenical Councils and in the sacred canons. Now that might seem to be a very definite statement affirming the primacy and universal jurisdiction of the Pope. But it's not quite as clear as it looks. There's this last clause, as is contained also in the Acts of the Ecumenical Councils and in the sacred canons. Quem ad modum etiam in gestis ecumenicorum conciliorum et in sacris canonibus continetur. What exactly does quem ad modum etiam mean? Gill and Tanner, whom I'm using here, translate quem ad modum as simply by the word as. So in that case, this final clause confirms what is said before. What the final clause means is what we have just said about the Pope ruling and teaching is precisely what the Acts of the Ecumenical Councils and the sacred canons assert. That was certainly the way the Latins understood it. But I suspect that the Greeks may have understood it as a qualifying clause rather than confirming. I think they understood it to mean insofar as this is contained in the Acts of the Ecumenical Councils and the sacred canons. Quem ad modum could, I think, be translated insofar as. And in that case, the Greeks would have said, we only accept such authority as is given to the Pope by the Ecumenical Councils and the Holy Canons. So they may have seen it as qualifying what goes before. And the next paragraph perhaps confirms this, because the next paragraph says, also renewing the order of the other patriarchs which has been handed down in the canons, the Patriarch of Constantinople should be second after the Most Holy Roman Pontiff, third should be the Patriarch of Alexandria, fourth the Patriarch of Antioch, and fifth the Patriarch of Jerusalem, without prejudice to all their privileges and rights. Now, that suggests that the Pope is not to be isolated. He is the first, but he's the first within a hierarchy of patriarchates, and all the rights of the other patriarchs are confirmed by the councils. I think this further paragraph referring to the other patriarchates was vital from the Greek point of view. I don't think they would ever have signed the Act of Union unless there had been a passage of such a kind. So the Pope is not isolated. Now, I mustn't go on too long, but let me briefly refer to things that were not mentioned in the Florentine Act of Union. First, nothing is said about the essence-energies distinction upheld by St. Gregory Palamas. Now, in the 15th century, as also today, there were many people in the West who considered that this distinction was dubious or even heretical. For a Western statement of all this, look at the Dictionnaire de Théologie Catholique, at the article by Martin Jougy about Palamas. And Martin Jougy was a very learned man, though of somewhat narrow sympathies. So the Orthodox have been criticized for this distinction. However, the Emperor John VIII was determined that this should not be put on the agenda. I think for two reasons. First, he feared if they started discussing this, they would never end, because it is an extremely obscure matter. But secondly, he realized that the Greeks themselves were not united on this point, and some of them were critical of Palamas. Another thing that is not mentioned in the Union of Florence is the question of divorce, which some Western theologians would think a defect among the Orthodox, that we grant divorce and allow remarriage. This was in fact mentioned right at the end of the Council of Florence. I think Pope Eugenius said, "We hear that you grant divorces, and we think this is a bad idea." And the Greeks replied somewhat cryptically, "We do not grant divorces without good reasons." And they left that. So, of course, they wanted to go home by now. But still, that suggests that the matter of divorce could be regarded as a point where East and West can have different disciplines, that it can be included within the plurality of the two sides. It was not seen at Florence as an impedimentum dirimens. Another thing that isn't mentioned in the discussions at Florence is the Immaculate Conception of the Blessed Virgin Mary. That, however, is not surprising, because at that point it had not yet been defined in the West, and was not indeed held universally by all Western theologians. Actually, just about the time that the Florentine Union was signed, at the Council of Basel, which was going on all this time, they did make a statement defining the Immaculate Conception, which is accepted in the Western Church. But Florence said nothing about this. The Greeks did not start criticizing the Latins for affirming the Immaculate Conception until the 17th century. I would add that I don't myself think that this is a fundamental question between us. In any case, it concerns not primarily the status of the Mother of God. It is a question of how you understand the consequences of the fall. Were the Greeks out-argued at Florence? Possibly. The Latins were trained in the traditions of scholasticism, and the Greeks were not familiar with this way of doing theology. Greek theology tended to be less clearly defined, more mystical, based on appeals to the fathers rather than on arguments. So there was, underlying the discussions, different understandings of the way you should theologize. The Greek delegates were often not very happy about all the distinctions that the Latin scholastic theologians were making. One of the Georgian envoys protested, this is typical, when Montenero appealed to the authority of Aristotle. He said, "What about Aristotle? Aristotle, a fig for your fine Aristotle." And when Montenero asked him, "Well, what do you approve of? What are your authorities?" the Georgian replied, "St. Peter, St. Paul, St. Basil, Gregory the theologian, a fig for Aristotle, Aristotle." Well, there you see different approaches to theology. The one patristic, appealing mainly to authorities, that's the Orthodox, the Eastern Christian approach. The other more systematic, appealing more to arguments, to distinctions and definitions. It's interesting that Bessarion wrote, this was before he had accepted the union, "The words of the fathers by themselves alone are enough to solve every doubt and to persuade every soul. It was not syllogisms or probabilities or arguments that convinced me, but the bare words of the fathers." Oh, well, that was written after he had accepted union with Rome. So he said it was the appeal to patristic evidence which convinced him at Florence, not the arguments used. Orthodox are often inclined to make this kind of objection. Latin theology is too logical, relies too much on reason. I recall a discussion I heard many years ago. Actually, it was between two Anglicans, but it illustrates my point. It was between my teacher, Father Derwas Chitty, who wrote on monasticism, and the professor of philosophy at Reading University, Harold Hodges, who was a great admirer of the Orthodox. And they were arguing about some theological point. And Chitty exclaimed with characteristic vehemence, "We don't want that kind of Latin logic." And Hodges replied very fairly, "There's no such thing as Latin logic. There's good logic and there's bad logic." Well, I think this is correct, that the Orthodox objecting to the use of precise reasoning perhaps is an evasion. It's interesting, actually, to look at Mark of Ephesus. As long as the discussion was in general terms, arguments based on Latin logic, Mark held his own. He was quite able to respond to the arguments of the Latins. But when they decided to stop having general arguments and to look at texts of the Fathers, Mark was silenced because he could not answer the texts that the Latins produced supporting the double procession. All Mark was able to say was, these texts have been corrupted. But he didn't have any evidence to show that they were corrupted, so that wasn't a very helpful line of argument. So, yes, perhaps the Greeks were at a disadvantage in the discussions, but I wouldn't want to make too much of that. Let me, before I end, just draw attention to a very interesting feature in the decree of union. It begins, "Let the heavens be glad and let the earth rejoice, for the wall that divided the Western and the Eastern Church has been removed. Peace and harmony have returned." Now, very significantly there, it is not said that the Greeks have been in heresy and schism and are now returning to the unity of the church. The assumption there is that there is a schism within the church, that both parts, the Latin and the Greek, are within the church, And the schism does not mean that either side is totally outside the church. The wall that divided the Western and Eastern churches has been removed. So the actual final decree in that way is fairly moderate. When you have in the 16th century the Reformation, very quickly on the Catholic side it was felt that the Protestants were outside the church. So that idea of schism within the church was soon set aside in the 17th century, 16th century. But as regards the Greeks, there was a continuing feeling we are still members of one church, but we are divided. A success that failed. Why did it fail? I suggested one reason, which was that the Byzantine people, and still more the Serbs and the Russians and the Bulgarians, were not prepared to accept the union. There was no process of reception. And there's a lesson for us here in our current interchurch dialogues, the need to involve the total people of God. But I would also add another point. The real reason why the Orthodox people did not accept the Council of Florence was not, in my view, the doctrine of the Filioque, which was understood by very few people. The real reason, I think, was what Theophylact says: love had grown cold. The Greeks, from 1204 onwards, felt a deep resentment and hostility towards the Latins because of what the Crusaders had done. This did not apply to all the Greeks. It did not apply to some of the more educated ones. But the bulk of the people, and especially the monks, saw the Latins as the enemies of their nation, the Greek nation, because of what had been done at the sack of Constantinople. And they continued to feel a deep resentment and anger because of that. This, I think, rather than a theological reason, is the real explanation of why the Council of Florence was not accepted. Today, happily, we do not feel the same resentment and anger, though if you scratch Orthodox, you can discover a lot of fanaticism just below the surface. However, I think today love has grown a little warmer, and that is why perhaps, although Florence failed in the 15th century, we might have hopes of better success today. Thank you.